The subject of psychology, or more precisely what came to be called sometime after its inception, depth psychology, has been a very lively topic throughout the entire 20th century, and promises to become in some ways perhaps an even livelier topic in the 21st century. Because it was right only about 2 years before the 19th century turned into the 20th that the Viennese physician, Dr. Sigmund Freud, published his what really became not only the opening salvo of depth psychology, but that probably remained his most famous book all throughout his life, The Interpretation of Dreams. Then, as the century, the 20th century moved on, depth psychology, or psychoanalysis as it was called initially, became ever more noted and popular, both in a theoretical sense of the many books that the psychologists and psychoanalysts wrote, and also in terms of the therapeutic disciplines which they developed. One asks oneself after all this time, being away from the historical time when this all started, as to why now, at the beginning of the 21st century, one of the certainly pivotal and seminal figures of the depth psychological movement, namely Carl Gustav Jung, who was the early associate of Sigmund Freud and his chosen successor until the time when they parted company, why this man would now be revealed as a mystical and prophetic figure of really major import, with the publication of the long-delayed publication of his mysterious book, which the real title of which is Liber Novus, the new book in Latin, and the popular book because of its original and continued red binding, the Red Book. So why should this happen, and why should this happen at this particular time? Since I read the journals and I'm in contact more or less with a lot of people in the Jungian psychological fold and elsewhere, I noticed that there is some questioning of that circumstance going on. Although I must say that so far I was very happily surprised that the reception of the book in the psychological community and on the part of the public at large has been very positive. The Jung family and the editor and translator of the book, Dr. Sonu Shamdasani, who is really a very, very pleasant and very, very learned gentleman. I like him very much. Did not expect the kind of overwhelming reception that they received. I don't have the figures at hand, I have them somewhere, but what are figures? I never liked numbers, I was very bad at mathematics and everything that is connected with it, and the numbers game just somehow never appealed to me. It still doesn't. But let us say Norton Company, who is the official publisher of the book, was absolutely astonished. Each printing sold out before it was available, and kept going and kept going. So there are a tremendous number of books which at the cheapest price, and in the beginning it was a lot more expensive than that, is between $100 and $150 for one book, you know. But what a book! At that price, and in the present economic conditions, the sales were almost miraculous, and it, I think it is received, I think, in a much more positive manner than many of us expected. But you know, the question is still a legitimate question at the outset of our consideration of this book, to ask that question: how come that this would take place, and would take place at this time? Now, what we need to remember, however, and very few people do, that the depth psychological movement itself, along with a number of other movements, both scientific and religious or quasi-religious, had a common beginning. Psychology really until Freud, so just about until the year 1900. I think the book on dreams, the interpretation of dreams, was published in English in 1900, in German a couple of years before. Up to that time, psychology was a branch of philosophy. When William James, the great American philosopher and psychologist, wrote about psychology, it was still a philosophical discipline. Yeah? Therefore, the beginnings of depth psychology, or psychoanalysis, as it was called at that time, are important to consider. Sigmund Freud, at that time a young, just graduated physician from Vienna, on a scholarship, because he was quite a poor man at that time, went to Paris to attend the lectures of a famous doctor, alienist, as they called them at that time, doctors who dealt with the troubles of the mind, by the name of Charcot. And there he was confronted with a curious experience. Charcot was a very dramatic man, as Frenchmen occasionally are. You know, even we poor Hungarian Americans like myself, you know, no matter how much we aspire to being really dramatic, we never make it as well as a Frenchman. The Frenchmen are all natural-born artists, no matter what they are doing. In any event, Charcot was a very impressive man. He was tall, he had long, flowing hair, and he lectured in a kind of amphitheater-like auditorium, you know, with the seats being graduatingly coming down at the Salpêtrière Hospital, which was one of the big mental hospitals in Paris at the time. And the feature of his lectures that really excited Freud was that Charcot would bring in various people whom he knew, and they were probably mostly patients and students of his, and then he would put them into a fairly light hypnotic trance. And then he would suggest to them, while they were in the entranced condition, that when awakened, you know, post-hypnotic suggestion, as we call it now, that when awakened, they would manifest symptoms of various ailments. For instance, they would awaken and they would feel as if some limb were paralyzed. They would feel as if they were blind, or that if they couldn't talk. And sure enough, when they came out of the hypnotic trance condition, these symptoms were present, without, of course, any other reason but the suggestion of Dr. Charcot. And the conclusion that Charcot drew from this was that there are many symptoms of physical ailments among humanity which have probably primarily a mental reason. Something is suggesting to the person that they would have these conditions. When Sigmund Freud went back to Vienna, he came to the conclusion that there could exist a situation that paralleled that of Charcot's hypnotic experiments, that there may be numerous people around with serious physical symptoms, which, although they were not hypnotized by anybody and did not receive a post-hypnotic suggestion, but they were somehow suggested to them, forced upon them, brought about at the physical level by something in their mind. And certainly not in the mind that they had direct access to, because they certainly were not aware of this taking place. And so Freud went into a partnership with another doctor named Hoeller, and they hypnotized patients who had such what at that time were called hysterical ailments. And by hypnotizing them, they tried to penetrate to the causative agents in their mind that made them have these symptoms, which had no physiological, no pathological reason in the body, but which appeared nevertheless. And later on, when some argument developed between Freud and his partner, they broke a partnership, and then Freud was in a difficult position, because with all of that he was a very poor hypnotist. He didn't know how to do it. Dr. Hoeller did, but he didn't. He says, well, geez, now what am I going to do? Here goes my livelihood. And then he was inspired to discover and to postulate that he would be able to penetrate to these regions of the mind which caused people to have their so-called hysterical ailments by making them talk about their dreams. Once this process got started, it worked very well. And from the symbolism of the dreams, Freud was able to find very often, no doctor succeeds always, he was able to find what at a deep level in the minds of these people made them have these hysterical ailments and hysterical symptoms. And he also found that when these apparent causes were found, symptoms disappeared. Mm-hmm. So we are all familiar with the term knowledge is power. Well, knowing what curious mental causes were present in these people, this knowledge in itself would put an end to the symptoms. But we need to keep in mind that this was of course the beginning of what we call depth psychology, because it was the kind of psychology that addresses itself to the deep mind, the mind that is not accessible to ordinary rational efforts and ordinary rational thought, that the people consciously don't know about themselves. It came to be called psychoanalysis at that particular time. I think probably the reason that I'm gabbing here so much about Freud is that even though I was always mostly fond of Jung and of Jung's thought and Jungian psychology, at a certain period of my life, I wore many hats at different times in my life. I actually like hats, but the one that I wore at that time, that I had a job at which I worked for about 2.5 years as the research assistant of a then very famous American writer, historical novelist, Irving Stone. Very nice gentleman, God rest him. And Mr. Stone had hired me to help him with his writing of a book, you guessed it, about the life of Sigmund Freud, which came to be entitled Passions of the Mind. I actually became acquainted with Mr. Stone when he was working on his book on Michelangelo, and then when he was writing this book, then he hired me. So I had to read and digest just about everything that Sigmund Freud wrote. And that covers a big couple of shelves on a bookshelf, and that's when I really became acquainted with these things. But now, tracing it back a little further, what was it that Charcot did? What was it that Bleuler and Freud were trying to do? They were working with a technique that came to be called at a certain time hypnotism, and that gave them access to deeper regions of the mind. Where did this originate? How did the various people, medical and otherwise, became aware of this? Well, it was quite a while before, maybe about just about a century before Freud wrote his book on dreams. Just before the French Revolution broke out, another Austrian doctor by the name of Franz Anton Mesmer had begun to practice and to teach some techniques whereby he could induce an altered state of consciousness in people. They came to be called mesmerism. And it was controversial, new things always are. Mesmer was even condemned by the most prestigious intellectual assembly of the West, the French Academy. The people who belong to the French Academy, the academicians, are known as the immortals. Yeah. So depending on the number of academicians that they're the 70 immortals or whatever the case may be. And they condemned Mesmer. And one person who was there at the time and who also voted against Mesmer was Benjamin Franklin, believe it or not, who was, of course, the American emissary to France at that time. But whether they condemned it or not, this let's say, this effort of inducing in various ways and at various depth altered states of consciousness became a very, very important factor. And it's sort of divided into two branches. One branch became sort of religious or quasi-religious. In other words, the hypnotic, as we would call it later on, because really this mesmerism did not receive the name hypnotism until quite a while later. There was an English doctor by the name of Baird who named it hypnotism. Hypnos in Greek means sleep. But let's say these kinds of efforts, these kind of manipulations of the mind, so many people felt, and with some considerable justification, gave the person with the altered state access to realms of knowledge and information and inspiration which bore a more or less religious character, which were related to the kind of thing that generally occurred in religion. And the biggest, the most popular, vastly popular in the 19th century, vastly popular movement along those lines was spiritualism, or as they called it in France, Spiritism. You know, because people learned how to put themselves or were put into this altered state of consciousness, some sometimes a very deep one, sometimes a lighter one, and then in that state of consciousness they were bringing forth information and what appeared to be messages from the other world, and often according to the interest of the times, from the spirits of the dead. Others in the same, let's say, of the same school generally, had begun to use this mesmeric or hypnotic principle in order to bring about healings, which of course was very similar to what Mesmer did. And among these, we find, even though some of them, let's say, had violently denied their connection with Mesmer and Mesmerism, and one thinks they protested too much, like Mary Baker Eddy, I think, protested too much. You know, she was against Mesmerism and evil animal magnetisms and all kinds of things. Actually, I hope I'm not stepping on anyone's religious tradition, but she was really a rather paranoid lady, if we want to use that term. But in any event, a whole school developed which held, and of course it's still around, that ailments, difficulties of the body primarily, are caused by the mind rather than by anything else, and therefore they can be cured by the way of the mind. Yes?
I'm wondering...
You were wondering when I'm going to get around to the Red Book, right? No? No? Okay.
I was wondering...
Yeah.
I was wondering if there's ever any evidence of hypnotism being used by the Greeks or the Romans, or, I mean, it's kind of unbelievable that just in...
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's nothing new under the sun, as the scripture says. Well, let's put it this way, it certainly wasn't called hypnotism or mesmerism, but let's put it this way, people from the beginning of time had found numerous ways of altering their consciousness, of getting away from this extroverted, rational kind of consciousness that we are using every day, let's say our daylight consciousness, and the the means, the methods that they employed in order to induce altered states of consciousness are a legion. You know, so I would say that analogous, similar disciplines definitely existed and do exist in various cultures in various times of history. So it was not it was a novel thing for Western culture at that particular time in the 19th and 20th century, but certainly there are precedents for that sort of thing. Anyway, to keep on with the long story, sort of a whole family of movements and the schools of thought and activity developed, and some along this kind of quasi-religious line, often with a very heavy emphasis on healing, which is the New Thought movement, which is still with us, and which for some reason has always been very popular in America, in the United States, and has been reborn now in various aspects of the so-called New Age movement. You know, it's always there, that you can do things with your mind. You can attract good things to you, and you can repel bad things from you. And you know, that appeals to people. Oh, you mean I don't have to get a job, and I can attract money to myself? You know, I don't have to be nice or good looking, and I can attract nice partners to myself, you know, nice ladies or whatever. And so, you know, it's a very appealing idea. And I don't want to go into it further, but let's say, you know, this has gone on. And the spiritualist movement, of course, although it also included healings at times, was primarily a manner of alleged and perhaps sometimes genuine communications with the souls of the departed. And it became tremendously popular because the 19th century, even as the 20th and the 21st, at the top, at the normative intellectual level, became more and more materialistic. And people were told by the intellectual leaders of the culture that you know, once you are dead, you're dead. Even as the new atheists nowadays, you know, one or two of whom, like Christopher Hitchens, I think is a darling man. He is really a very appealing person. And others, Bart Ehrman, a great biblical scholar, and others too. You know, now there is again there is a strong intellectual elite around who are militant atheists. But there were even more of them at that time. And so the general populace wanted proof that these leaders of the culture are wrong, that there is a life after death, and so forth. And that's what gives spiritualism such a great big boost. I mean, it was a gigantic movement, especially in the United States, but also in Europe. I mean, the White House, in the royal courts of Europe, and in the humblest dwellings everywhere, there were mediums who were putting themselves in one way or the other in this altered state, and they were bringing forth things. In the late 20th century, we called it channeling, right? Very much the same thing. Now then, on the other hand, of course, this also penetrated into the scientific world, and then by way of hypnotism, their medical hypnotism began, which then culminated to some extent in what Charcot was doing first, and then in Freud and the psychoanalysis. So that was sort of the medically oriented branch. But why am I saying all of this stuff? You know, and that's not what you came here to hear, right? But I'm saying it because I'm trying to indicate that there was a powerful force in the culture that discovered that by entering some kind of altered state of consciousness by one means or the other, one would have access to a greater amount of information, a greater amount of inspiration, that there is somehow a realm to which the mind can have access, but does not really have access to it in our ordinary state of consciousness. And then when depth psychology and psychoanalysis came, they called this realm the unconscious, which doesn't sound so good in English. Because when you think, oh yeah, well, he's unconscious, he passed out. You know, you can be unconscious for having visited the friendly neighborhood bar for too long, or whatever the case may be. But in German, das Unbewusste, which is what it's translated as the unconscious, is a little, somehow a little more precise. That which is not conscious, that of which you are not aware. And consequently, the early psychologists in the late 19th and the early 20th century were all very greatly interested in, well, what should we say, in matters that related to different states of consciousness. The great early psychologists at the time of Freud and thereafter were all very interested in the occult and in matters of that sort. And many of them wrote books that were sort of semi-fictional, or at least that were occult stories, you know. A very famous Swiss psychologist before Jung, French-Swiss, Theodore Flournoy, for instance, wrote a big book, the Zend à la planète Mars, From India to the Planet Mars, in which he mainly catalogued the disclosures of a patient of his who was entranced and who had all of these elaborate visions about Indian, you know, mythology and gods and things like that in India, and eventually her consciousness ended up on the planet Mars and was telling people what was going on over there. Sort of early science fiction. So, you know, psychologists at that early time were very interested in this because it was the borderline. They were really borderline scientists. And so even true of Freud. Freud had a very materialistic upbringing. His father was a Jewish man of Jewish people, but an atheist, and he was educated in very atheistic and materialistic spirit at the university and all of that. But he had a great desire to somehow try to find out whether these strange things, these occult things, these mysterious things, whether there might be some truth in them. And he kept that up till the end of his life, when he went into exile from the Nazis in England. He was still exploring these things. I saw the original letter, an original letter, which Freud wrote at that time from England to a psychoanalyst here in America. And in it he said, if I had to live my life over again, I would not devote it to psychoanalysis, but to psychical research. Yeah? These things were very much part of early psychology. And therefore, it is not to be met with, I think, too much amazement that Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychologist, who was really the next in charge, the next in command to Sigmund Freud for a number of years in the early years of the psychoanalytic movement, and who really became probably the second most famous and most important psychologist within the depth psychological movement, should have had a constant orientation toward the mystical and toward the occult. Of course, it was under Freud's influence. He had to kind of cool it, if you don't mind that term, you know, because while Freud was interested in these things too, Freud was afraid that his new science, as he loved to call it, it never really became a science, but that his new science would be made disreputable, would you know, be regarded as something kooky if the interest of the prominent psychoanalysts in the borderline field would be revealed. And so Jung also had to be somewhat subdued about this. But he, in my estimation, and certainly I'm only one student, Jung was a natural mystic. From the time that he was really very young, and really I would say the best introduction to the Red Book that you can avail yourself of, in addition to the very, very scholarly and very, very well put together introduction of Dr. Shandasani in the book itself, but is Jung's autobiographical notes called Memories, Dreams, and Reflections of C.G. Jung by Aniela Jaffe. They are being criticized. That particular book is being criticized nowadays in the light of the Red Book and so forth because it's fragmentary. But it had to be that way because although Dr. Jung gave his student and his amanuensis Aniela Jaffe a great deal of information of things that are in the Red Book and so forth, they were afraid to publish it at that time too. So Memories, Dreams, and Reflections has sort of Red Book material in it, but very fragmentary and very much disguised. But if you read it, and if you read between the lines, you can see that you know the whole matrix is all there. So it's a very, very good book to read. And if you read there, you get, as I say, you get a good entree into this strange world that was there and that Jung was interested in. By the way, just to indicate to you what the strange interlinking of the esoteric and the occult with depth psychology, when C.G. Jung broke with Freud, when their friendship and their partnership was, so to say, dissolved, when Jung went on his own, which was sort of around 1910, 11, 12, thereabouts. Then Freud, back in Vienna, picked another man whom he designated as his successor. And who do you think that was? It was a man by the name of Johann Jacob van der Leeuw, who was a prominent theosophist for most of his life, a big close friend of C.W. Leadbeater and Krishnamurti and of all of these people, and who toward the end of his life sort of drifted away from theosophy and developed a very powerful interest in psychoanalysis. He wanted to become a psychoanalyst. Very brilliant man, and a very energetic man. And Freud used to refer to him as unser fliegende Holländer in German, our flying Dutchman, because Dr. van der Leeuw was an amateur aviator and he flew his own plane. In fact, that was his downfall, literally, because while flying over North Africa, he crashed with his plane and died. And these were the only two men whom Sigmund Freud designated openly as his successors, Jung and van der Leeuw. No one else. And here were all these all these medical doctors and Austrian and German and English and so forth, were clustered around Freud and who worshipped Freud like a god. He didn't really respect them. He said bad things about them. I won't even repeat them. They are so bad, But he respected the people with a mystical, with an occult bent, even though he couldn't bring himself quite to that point. It's really it's a very interesting subject. In any event, so it's quite understandable that even though Jung had to keep his mystical interests and so forth quite undercover when he was associated with Freud, that he really couldn't do it. Because as a natural-born mystic, he had the drive toward in that direction. And he literally did, the better biographies will tell you this. He sort of literally had to discipline himself and force himself to become more rationalistic and more scientific and more extroverted in his orientation in order to please his boss, Freud. And it grated on him. He was an unhappy man because he couldn't really go in the direction he wanted to. And that is, of course, why then eventually they came to a parting of the ways. Because Jung began to insist that there is a deeper layer and aspect to the unconscious than Freud was willing to admit, and that the sexual content of the unconscious and the sexual origins and etiology, as it is called in medicine, of the neuroses are a relatively superficial layer of the unconscious. I mean, we all are sexual beings since we live in this body and so forth, and then there are all kinds of issues connected with that. But Jung said, that's only a small part of the situation. He says, below that, there is all kinds of really powerful, really mysterious, really astonishing material in the unconscious. The deeper you penetrate, the more astonishing things you find. And of course, Freud was unwilling to admit that. And so that is when the division, the break came about. And that is when Jung began to do what? Write the material of the Red Book. Now, when you listen to sort of Freudians, and it's a difficult task to listen to Freudians, then they will always tell you that he wrote the Red Book because he was so disturbed over his break with Freud, that because he renounced his father, who was Freud, and all of that, and so this unhappiness and stress then manifested him writing a really weird book. But it's really the other way around. It's really the other way around. He wrote the Red Book because this material was coming forth, and he had to get away from Freud, or Freud had to in turn condemn him and renounce him, because the inspiration, the material was welling forth in Jung, and he couldn't contain it any longer. So it was really the Red Book-like material, his inspiration that was breaking out, that caused the break rather than the other way around. And these circumstances, I think, are important to remember. First of all, the powerful early connections between the occult, mystical, and the depth psychology, which has been greatly glossed over in the course of the 20th century. And it really takes good historical research to unearth it and to find it. So that's the first, very important issue. And the other important issue is that Jung broke with Freud because the great eruption in his own soul, in his own unconscious, was taking place, and that this was incompatible with staying with Freud. So now then, how about the writing of the Red Book itself? Jung felt that he had to do something, that the way he was and the way he was going was unsatisfactory, that he had allowed his own deeper self and the desires and the inspiration, the direction that was coming forth from his deeper self, that he had allowed these things to be repressed. And that therefore something, so to say, something had to give, something had to happen. It was as the result of these mounting feelings, then, that in 1913 he sat down and, as he said, allowed himself to drop. That's the expression that uses memories, dreams, and reflections. The expressions used in the notebooks and so forth in connection with the Red Book are a little different. And enter a realm of experience that he previously had not been really the partaker of. And there he found, an immense amount of visionary and inspirational material that he then came to write down in quite a large number of sort of, some of them were at the exhibit, at the Red Book exhibit, little black notebooks that are maybe about this tall. Would you agree? Notebooks that people use in school and things of that sort. And there he started taking notes of his experiences, which he had, I think, exclusively at night. And in the daytime he carried on his work like before, except that during that period of time from 1913 through 1916, up to a couple of years later, he didn't write any books like he did before. But that was the only difference as far as his outer life was concerned. And so he really began to lead sort of two parallel lives, one at night when he was writing, and one in the daytime when he was receiving patients. And he was already married, he already, they were having children, they were building, I think, the beautiful house in Zurich, which is still owned by the Jung family and all of that. So he led a perfectly normal daylight existence, and at night he addressed himself to these mysterious matters. Somehow in connection with this by synchronicity really, I came across of a statement of H.P. Blavatsky that she made verbally to someone, where she said, let's see, how about it? I got to quote her right because she'll punish me. You know, it's a fate worse than death to be punished by H.P. Blavatsky. You know, he said, my days are my manvantara, and my nights. No, my days are my pralaya, and the nights are my manvantara. So that you know, these are Sanskrit words that refer to manifestation and the lack of manifestation, so that her creation, her powerful activity occurred at night. And of course we know that she was up most nights writing and so forth. So it's not that unusual to have that kind of situation, that kind of division, so to say, in one's life. That brings us then to the Red Book itself. And I'll just share a couple of details of what was happening just about the time when he started writing the Red Book, and then we'll have a very brief intermission. You know, 1913, it was already beginning to manifest. Also, World War I was coming. It didn't. That circumstance really didn't have anything to do as yet with the war. Jung was called into the service of the Swiss army. You know, in Switzerland, to this day, everybody it's not a volunteer army. Everybody serves, I think, about 2 years or something like that in the army. And he was in the medical corps since he was a doctor, and he was assigned to a particular place, some distance from his residence, where there was the army camp and where he worked. And then later on, there were internees of the belligerent powers of World War II, various people who were interned there, because Switzerland was a neutral country, and so they tried to keep the people the Germans and the British were fighting with each other, and they isolated them during the war, so that they wouldn't spy and do various things of that sort. And Jung was beginning to have some really disturbing experiences, visionary experiences. There were about 3 or 4 of them within that period of time, all of which indicated that some big disaster was coming. They are already indicated in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, and then Dr. Shamdasani in his introduction and commentaries in the Red Book writes about them in greater detail. He saw, for instance, a big sea of blood and fire rising out on the periphery, on the borders of Switzerland, of the mountains, licking up against the mountains, trying to engulf his country where he was living. But he said the mountains rose to defend them, so the flood did not really enter. You know, it was one, and there were a number of others, and he wondered, what is this all about? And being a depth psychologist, and so the general tendency in depth psychology is that pretty much everything that we dream about is about ourselves, not about anything else. And that, of course, this says this, that something is trying to engulf me, something is trying to get me. You know? Maybe I'm about to have a nervous breakdown or one thing or the other. And then all of a sudden the rumblings began, and the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, in Bosnia. The war broke out. And now you said, aha, that's what it was. So it was a great relief to him that he wasn't being engulfed by some kind of malign psychological forces, but that he actually had a premonition of an objective event in the outer world. So these visions, and they were waking visions, they were not dreams. And he had one of them in the train where he was going to his army camp, and things that convinced him that there was a prophetic, even a predictive prophetic element that was entering his consciousness, that he was being led and he was being shown symbolically events that were about to happen at that time at some distance of 1 year or a year and a half or less than that in the outer world. And this was a great relief to him that he was not about to engulfed by psychological forces, but that on the other hand, he was apparently led to to some extent and degree to a prophetic vision of what may happen in the future. And this, they don't talk about this very much, the people who are dealing with the Red Book now. But as I'll show you in a few minutes, the initial keynote, right on the very first page of the Red Book, indicates that this is a book of prophecy. So there's a definite prophetic keynote there, and I'm after all, I can put myself in Carl Jung's mind, but I am quite convinced that when he started writing the Red Book, he thought that he was going to write some material of a prophetic nature that will foretell what is going to happen in the future. And you know, that kind of idea or that kind of desire would have been very natural at that time, because World War I was an incredible horror, an incredible development. Not only did it kill more people than any other war before and all of that, but it was also, it's really the great historical watershed, which put an end to an entire long historical era. It put an end to an entire world. And everything was different after World War I was over. You know, my father, who was very much older than my mother, my father was 53 years old when I was born. My father lived through World War I, and he lived already, he was already a middle-aged man before when the war broke out. So he lived quite a few years before World War I, and then, thank God, quite a few years afterwards. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here, and I don't know what's a mixed blessing, but you know, nevertheless. And so I got this from my father as well. He says, you know, you cannot imagine, he used to say, how different everything was before World War I and is now, just entirely different. So it was a tremendous, so in the time of when these great changes were taking place, there would be a particular desire in a person to try to see what things are going to be like, what is coming, the things that are coming, you know, the very words in the Red Book. So he really started out with that, it would seem, by sensing that kind of prophetic intent. But what happens then? Then he begins to discover, and it is not such a simple discovery, but it goes on and on and on, months and months and months of experiences show him that in order to play to some degree that kind of prophetic role, he has to change. He has to transform. He has to undergo a a vast and extremely arduous, and he never denied it, perilous, dangerous process. And then he will be what he's supposed to be. Then he will be able to play that kind of prophetic role. And you've got to remember, we can talk about, you know, the definition of a prophet is not just a guy or a girl who talks about the future. That's a particular feature, you know. The definition of a prophet is someone who is in contact with the divine. You know? Someone to whom the divine talks and discloses things. That is a prophet. You know? Now, most anybody can talk to God if he wants to, but there are very few people to whom God talks. It's often not a two-way process at all. You know, in fact, there's kind of an old joke about a clergyman, you know, who went to his chapel, knelt down, and he started praying and said, "Oh God," and all of a sudden a big booming voice came from somewhere saying, "Yes," and the clergyman collapsed with a heart attack. so you know, a lot of people talk to God. Very few people are being talked to by God. That's just the way things are. But obviously, so we got to keep these two things in mind, and there are of course a great many other things. But I think these are the two pillars, like the two pillars of the Temple of Solomon, you know, Boaz and Jachin, which. Someone pronounced them Boaz and Jackass. Well, it rhymes, you know. But these are really the two pillars that sort of hold up the Red Book. Jung's prophetic mission, which has to do with sort of trying to prepare the way for some very important psycho-spiritual developments that are going to take place in the world, and he even gives the figure in the Red Book, and he gave the figure verbally to people elsewhere, that these developments would come fully into fruition. They would fully manifest about 800 years from the time that he wrote the Red Book. Now, the Red Book, right, so the 19, you figure it out, 1913, 100 of the 800 years is gone already. So, you know, here, I mean, we ought to rejoice. We only have to wait 700 years. Isn't that great? Right? But, you know, so that matrix of material is one thing. And then combined with that is all the material that has to do with how the process that Jung himself undergoes at the time when he's writing these things down to change and transform him and make him ready for being able to work toward and being able to announce some portion of that prophecy or those prophecies. So it's really it's Jung, the incipient, developing, transforming prophet. And it contains references both to the prophecies and to Jung's own transformation. And these are together in the book, and they're often hard to sort out. Also, every chapter of the book, and there are really three big divisions, three books in the Red Book. And they all have a Latin title, Liber Primus, Liber Secundus. The book is written in German. But owing to his classical education, Jung mixes some Latin in here and there, and even a little bit of Greek. and the people, or some figures that appear in the book, particularly one that I'll tell you about later on, whom he then comes to revere very greatly, and who really is, I would say, as close an approximation to the Theosophical mythos, and I don't mean that in the bad sense of the masters of wisdom. There is a particular person who becomes Jung's master in the book. And his name is always spelled in Greek. Jung always spells his name in Greek capital letters, never any other. I mean, that's the language, but in each chapter of Liber Primus, Liber Secundus, and then what has been added, and that he didn't really manage to transcribe much of that, the very last part, into the Red Book itself, but it's present in the notebooks, and then Dr. Shamdasani edited them and placed them, and that is called scrutinies. Jung intended to have those in there. But in each chapter starts with a vision, a whole story, a whole narrative of a particular vision that he has. And then that stops, and then there is sort of Jung's commentary on his own vision, the way he is trying to understand it, the way he is trying to process it and make sense of it. In the next chapter, it is there again. So both are equally valuable, but you can see a kind of progression, of course, in his commentaries, in the way that he relates to the material, that his own understanding, his own ability to internalize and to understand what is happening to him is growing. He's a naive, he's a baby in the woods at the beginning of the book, when he meets his soul and he calls out, he wants to see his soul. It just, when I first read it in the German, it made me cry because it's so pitiful. It says, meine Seele, wo bist du? My soul, where are you? I have been separated from you for so long. Can't you come to me again? You know, it's a really, really, really pitiful cry, and then the soul comes. And the soul is always feminine. The appearance of the soul and the character is that of a woman. It's what the reason for that is, don't ask me, but let's say we got to remember that a lot of languages, including German and Latin and God knows how many more, the nouns have a gender. So the masculine, feminine, neuter, you know. And so in German, the soul has a feminine gender. It's die Seele. Even as anima in Latin, but of course there's animus too, but anima in Latin, which is the main word for soul, is also feminine. It's a feminine ending. Some occultists, I'm trying to think who, probably Dion Fortune or some of those, and she was a pretty smart lady, to say that that there is a kind of gender-like rotation appearance in the different aspects of the human, or different principles, and that a man's soul is always feminine. Maybe, I don't know. But in any event, it's it's a distinct personality. It's a distinct being who speaks to him, and it's obviously a soul that is superior to and really quite different from his ordinary personality. So it's a higher principle. And the soul is there all the time in pretty almost in each chapter sort of helping him along and telling him what he ought to do now and helping him to interpret things and so forth. But he confesses at the beginning that basically he lost his soul. He was not in contact with his soul. And the reason for that being that he had to become so extroverted and so modern, so scientific that he lost in touch with these things, which he doesn't mention that in the Red Book, but obviously he had more contact with these deeper things when he was younger, but then owing to his professional life, he had to sort of get away from that, and this is where it comes back. So these are really the two big things, is the prophetic element, which then appears again and again. So, and then you can see that some of his own spiritual development is hooked up with what is to come. So the two are not, while I call them the two pillars, they are not really that much separated, because you can, what is happening to Jung, or much of what is happening to Jung, is what is happening and is to happen to the world. So there is a transgressivity, you know, between the two. And all of these intricate issues are in the book, and it's really a monumental job to work with it and to understand it. You know, when I gave my 13 lectures and commentaries on the book from beginning to end, beginning a year ago, October, you know, for several months, once a week, and I had to prepare for those lectures at much greater length than any talks that I gave in my life, and I have been lecturing for a long time, about 50 years, you know. And not only that, but you know, you have this book in front of you, read it, and things begin to happen. You know, nothing bad, but very unusual things begin to happen. I had to get up from the book, from the table, and walk around, and otherwise I would have gone into such an altered state of consciousness that I couldn't have done what I'm supposed to be doing. You know, it's a magic book. I can't put it. It's like you know, it's a grimoire, and you don't have to do anything. You have to just pay attention to it, and your consciousness really can change very greatly. But so really in basic outline form, that is really what is present. It's the prophetic element and the personal transformation of Jung, which, however, isn't all that personal, because it's the kind of transformation that every human has to go through and that the world has to go through in order to come to the new dispensation, so to say, which, as he said, would fully manifest, as he said, at that time, about 800 years from now. Now then, we will stop with the background and go to the book itself. So if you have any questions or perplexities about the background of the book and its writings and the material that I've just talked about, maybe you want to voice those now, and then we'll go right to the book. Yes, way back over there. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so far for the background. Very interesting. I wonder if Freud had something of a maybe still not known occult background, maybe some writings that have not yet surfaced. I know that Jung and Assagioli also tried to make a firewall between their metaphysical, esoteric life and convictions and their professional. So Jung did that, Assagioli did that. Is there anything indication that Freud might have had something of a
well,
hidden side?
Yeah, Freud certainly had you know, a great deal of interest in these matters, and let's say there are indications that he was inspired by some esoteric material, primarily of a Kabbalistic nature. There is an old book, I mean, published, I think, in the very early 60s, by an author named David Bakan, B-A-K-A-N, Freud and the Jewish Mystical Tradition. And you might want to, undoubtedly available here and there. And it was, the indication there was a teacher who had come to Vienna who was teaching Kabbalah. And that Freud went to all of his lectures and was very, very taken by that, and then probably did some reading on his own. And David Bakan actually felt that some of the specific features and teachings of Freud's psychoanalysis have a Kabbalistic origin. Not all, but some. That's really the only one I know of. The rest of it was sort of interest and experimentation with occult things, which, however, he always found some fault with it or denied it or one thing or the other. He also liked predictions and various, I think about 3 different people at 3 different points in Freud's life predicted when he would die, when Freud would die. And Freud believed it. He set all his affairs in order, he wrote his will, he was waiting to die. Nothing happened. And then afterwards we say, well, that's how much one can trust these occult things. They're all a bunch of balderdash. But the next time he did the same thing. So, you know, he was ambivalent. But in the midst of that ambivalence, there was also quite a bit of material that he absorbed from heterodox spiritual sources. Mm-hmm. Anything else, or should we go on? Yes?
I don't want to be on camera.
Sure, yeah.
I really don't want to be on camera. What is exactly, you mentioned soul. What is the soul for Carl Jung? What is it exactly?
No, that's a very big question.
I know.
When we get questions like that, we say, next question, please. You know. Well,
You were talking about it, so
yeah.
I was curious what he meant by that.
yeah, well, of course, we all know in generic terms and generally in the culture, soul, when people talk soul, people indicate the non-physical and possibly immortal part of their total selfhood, right? That's the soul, body and soul, whatever. But then, of course, depending on what tradition or what particular school you are dealing with, there are other meanings and there are other divisions. In this case, Jung doesn't define it, but it's apparently a higher self, a deeper part of himself that he felt at that time he had lost contact with and wanted to reestablish contact again. And he always refers to her as a feminine being. So it looks like it's sort of his own individual spiritual, or at least a part of his spiritual nature and being, and it appears to him as a being, as a person. And that's not unusual, because very, very often in the lives of mystics and so forth, these internal spiritual principles, when they manifest, they manifest in a particular visual form like a person. But so that's pretty much all that can be said, I think, about that at this point. Yeah. Okay. All right. So we still have, I think, a little time. So the circumstances of how the technical part of how this was written down, you can find in the introduction of the book. We really don't need to waste any time on it, but let's say it's just important to remember that Jung did not write the Red Book directly as it is now, but that he first wrote his experiences in the little notebooks, which how many of them are? About 9? Yeah, I think number 5 and number 7 and so were at the exhibit, and these he still wrote in his own, in C.G. Jung's usual handwriting, and he made sketches, which then later on became the pictures in the book. Then he read those over and he edited them, and then he had a very close and very trusted disciple of his retyped them, so there are typewritten manuscripts too, and from that typewritten manuscript, which he edited again, corrected again, then he wrote in this beautiful, unusual calligraphy into the book itself. And like somebody asked me here before what kind of material he was using, he started out, he thought, this is going to be great, I'm going to write on parchment, it's going to look like a real ancient thing. But then he wanted to put some pictures into the book and some of these big illuminated initials and things, and the paint ran on the parchment and became really not good. So he had to switch from the parchment to a good, really good quality white, quite white paper. And then he bought a big ream of these papers and gave them to a bookbinder there in Zurich, who bound it into a red leather binding, and then he wrote into the book. He did not write on separate loose pages, but he wrote into the book itself. And that's really how the book came to be. It's a little detail that might interest some of you, especially the ones who have the book. And this we found out purely by accident, because at the exhibit we got to converse with a very interesting gentleman who is the part owner of a graphics firm in Los Angeles, and he's the one who did the scanning of the original book for the publication. He had to go to Switzerland, and he told us the whole story. But that I'm not going to tell you. But a very, very interesting fellow. And so one of my friends who was there noticed that the color of the paper is a little different in the original and in this book. And also that the colors are very, very slightly different in the original and in the printed book. And the man said the reason for that is that the original is on a pure white paper, and that the editor and the Jung family wanted this book to be in a slightly off-white paper, that they felt it looked better. But this made a difference in the reproduction of the colors, for instance, that is, and then, that is how good. And there was actually a deal of material that he did not manage to transcribe, and that is in scrutinies, or some of that is in scrutinies, which is really the third book, so to say. All right, and that's, that has some importance. So the Liber Novus, the new book, as he called it, which again sort of indicates that it's a really intended as a kind of sacred book. So we have the old books, we have the old scriptures, and then we have the new scripture. Has a I will turn the book to it later, and then some of you can look at it. I can just describe it now. Most of the division, the chapters, and within the chapters, the certain divisions he indicates with a sort of illuminated initial letters. And these initial letters are sometimes completely pictures. So in the beginning of the first book, there is a fairly good-sized little picture on top, which is the initial letter D, because der Weg des Kommenden, and of course the der starts with the D, the way of the things to come, of that which is to come. And with that big D, there is a fairly large picture, which one would think, oh, well, you know, you just wanted to have a very nice little picture for the initial of the beginning, but when you look at it close, and especially when you blow it up large, you can see that it's a kind of a complete little cosmology. And what it's, when you just look at it, you think it's a landscape. And in a manner of speaking, it is. But as you look at it, there are various regions in it. It starts at the bottom. There is a kind of fiery material like magma at the center of the earth, and then there come different layers of earth, and there is coral and the depths of an ocean, and then you come up closer to the surface of the waters, and then there is obviously a sort of medieval-looking Swiss town with a church steeple. There is all, and so that's the land. And behind it there are alpine-looking mountains, and then above them there is sky and clouds, and then there is a region with the sun and the moon and the planets. And then way up on top, so you can hardly see it unless you magnify it quite a bit, there is the circle of the zodiac. And I said, oh, well, you know, it's a nice description of the cosmos, until we discovered, by looking at the very topmost part with the zodiac, that the zodiac is reversed. Now, what has a reversed zodiac? The zodiacal ages go backwards, you know? So, and then another very perceptive friend of mine discovered that there is a sort of a ray of the sun, a ray of the light that goes up, and that his light pierces the area between Pisces and Aquarius. Very subtle. Doesn't say anything about it, but there it is, indicates there. You see, we are the zodiacal age, the Platonic month, whatever you want, it is moving from Pisces into Aquarius. And really that is why the title is the way of the things to come, because there is a change, there is a movement. So Jung discovered the age of Aquarius quite a bit before the hippies. But of course, I mean, there was always the foundation of this idea in the precession of the equinoxes, it is called, which makes for the Platonic months. So you can see, and then of course in the letter D there is also a, let me see what that is. Yeah, it's a, Jung really likes snakes. The pictures are full of serpents in various contexts, and this one also at the bottom of the vertical bar of the D there is a pot out of which fire comes. And then out of the fire comes a serpent who is going clear up into the sky. So it's the serpent that comes from the fire and that rises. And, well, one can draw all kinds of conclusions, but there is certainly a bit of Kundalini symbolism there. The fire that is done and the serpent comes from it. And the first page of what is to come it starts with a number of quotations, which are all biblical, and the quotations are in Latin. Now that's very customary, you know, in old-fashioned scholarly circles, that the sacred scriptures and so would be quoted in the sacred language. And they are, the first two quotations are from Isaiah, and then there is one quotation from John. They are both from the 53rd chapter of Isaiah, 1 to 4th verse, and then from the 9th to the 6th verse. Then comes from the Gospel of John, and then Isaiah again. So there are 3 Isaiahs and 1 John. And the very last sentence of the last quotation is the precise passage from Isaiah, which allegedly he found in his mother's Bible at a certain point, and which was like a synchronicity or a bibliomancy. When he decided to go on his own and not have to do not to have any association with Freud anymore, then he did a little trick, and he opened up his mother's Bible and put his finger down. You know, people do that. It's a kind of a form of divination. I'm trying to quote from memory. It goes at least this is the substance of it. There is a way, and a holy way it shall be called, and no one will err when walking on that way. Even the fools will not err in it. And he said, well, this is an indication of his own way, that he has his own way to work. And incidentally, this incident of him having found that in his mother's Bible, I don't think is in any of the biographies, but it was told to us by Professor Quispel, the Dutch professor and Gnostic expert, who has also passed away, that Jung told that to him at one time. You saw that, you know, in that book. That's what I found. So you want to practice that kind of divination yourself, but be careful, because you don't know what you'll come up with. There is a silly story about that, which I'll nevertheless mention, and that somebody was very wanted an answer of what to do with his life, and big crisis. So he opened up the Bible and put his finger down on a place, and there it said, and Judas went out and hung himself on a tree. So the man said, oh, geez, that the Bible couldn't want me to commit suicide, for God's sakes. This is terrible. I probably did it wrong. Let me do it again. So he closed the Bible, he opened it up, put his finger down, and there was another sentence. It said, go thou and do likewise. I don't think it ever happened, but it's a good story, nevertheless. So all of these passages, incidentally, I don't have to read those to you, all of these passages are prophetic. So the book really starts out with that emphasis on prophecy. And they are prophetic Isaiah is one of the principal Old Testament sources that is taken by Christians to predict the coming of Christ. So all of these passages are indicate in some way or the other the coming of a Savior figure and of a new dispensation of salvation. So you can deduce by the quotations that he has picked that is the kind of prophetic material that he is talking about. And then he wrote under the quotations, written by C.G. Jung by his own hand in his house in Küsnacht, Zurich, in the year 1915. The quotations are all in Latin, but that means he entered it into the book in 1915. It was obviously received much earlier. And then I spoke to you about the illuminated initial letter, which very subtly and very obliquely points to the age of Aquarius. The changing of the zodiacal ages. And after that, now I need to come back to the translated part, because while I can read the German and I can translate from it when I look at it, but the problem with reading the original text is, first of all, that it is a slightly archaic German, and thirdly, that sometimes he writes in really large letters, and sometimes he writes in really small letters, and so you have a somewhat of a difficulty in reading it. The very first vision, and I think we can probably talk about that a little bit, that he is speaking about, is that there are two spirits that he is dealing with. And they are called in German the Geist der Zeit and the Geist der Tiefe. Geist der Zeit, and he didn't use the Nietzschean and other term Zeitgeist, which means very much the same, the spirit of the time, the spirit of our times, the spirit of the time within which we live. And the Geist der Tiefe means the spirit of the deep, the spirit of the depths. And so the very first vision, the very first thing that he's talking about is that he was living in the spirit of the times, which is extroverted, as we would call it now. Actually, the first book that Jung wrote after finishing the Red Book, which one do you think it was? It was the Psychological Types. Which is the most, well, people generally say that that's purely about ego psychology, and it's much more mundane book, but that's not really true. The trouble with Psychological Types is that people start reading it with the 10th chapter. That is where the extrovert, introvert, and the four functional types are. People don't pay any attention to the chapters that go before. The chapters that go before are very, very profound and very mystically oriented, that they sort of show how the fourfold tetramorph of the functions and things like that has a really very, very deep origin, and he quotes all kinds of ancient sources in the earlier chapters, and sources by poets and dramatists and all kinds of things, but people never read that. They only go to the practical part. So you can see that the material of Psychological Types has a close relationship to the Red Book, but you don't have to just go by that, because Jung said also to Professor Quispel, who told us this, that he wrote the entire book, Psychological Types. It's a hefty book, pretty big, on the basis of around 30 pages in the Red Book. He wrote that in a letter to a Dutch poet, Roland Horst, and Quispel saw the letter. And then Dr. Shamdasani has entered that into the commentaries, and since he got that information from me, my name is twice in the Red Book, I want you to know, in Dr. Shamdasani's reference notes. And one is about that information from CRISPR, and the other one is on another matter. And you may recall in the book there is one of the big whole page pictures, which has been actually published before the publication of the Red Book. There were a few pictures that are in the Red Book that Jung allowed to be published separately in some other books. And never mentioning that they are from the Red Book. They're just there, you know. And one of those is a picture that is actually a picture of the city of Basel, I believe, down below, you know, old city, a very important city in Switzerland. And then above Basel, there's sort of clouds and things, and then there is a gigantic flaming circle, and in the circle is an equal-armed cross, a tetramorphic cross. And underneath the circle there is a figure, a little figure with crossed legs sitting. It appears that that picture in the Red Book was a depiction of a vision of his of the fourfold nature of the universe and of the human psyche with its four functions of thinking, feeling, intuition, and sensations. It says something about me that the one that I almost forget is sensation. It's my poor sensate function. But we all have to have at least one pretty bad function, and then another one. We are lucky if we only have one that is poor. But so when Jung refers, or other people refer to the fact that a number of his teachings are really based on the Red Book, much of it is in the text, but a lot of it is also in the pictures. The pictures are visionary pictures that are depicting what he saw. And then he drew certain conclusions from that, and many of those conclusions he did not put into text. He did not write them down. And so the spirit of the depths is calling to him. That is the beginning. And so the implication is that he has been living too much in the spirit of the time, and that there is something down there, metaphorically speaking, something very important that is down in the deep, and he has to address himself to that, and he has to listen to it, he has to acquaint himself with the spirit of the deep. What is that? Well, I think in a generic term, we may say it, well, of course, it's the spirit of the unconscious. But then the question arises, what is the unconscious? You know? Well, obviously, all the different interlocking realities which are not external and which are not available to us in our ordinary lives when we follow the spirit of especially when we follow the spirit of the time. And you know, the spirit of the time in the early 1900s, I mean, he started this around 1913, even though the world has changed so tremendously since that time, the zeitgeist, to use the Nietzschean term, or the one he uses here, hasn't changed that much. It's very similar. It's extroverted, it's materialistic, it does not address itself in any creative manner to the depths, and it forever calls to the human being to address himself to concerns of one kind or the other out there. Now, what we have to remember is it doesn't mean that everything that the culture and that the spirit of the time wants us to address out there is bad. Some of it is, but not all of it. But there is a problem with it. And the very problem it is that it is outside. We can keep on addressing ourselves to outward things, but if we don't cultivate our own inner life, and if we don't heed the spirit of the deep, come now inside, come down here and look what's there. Look what the deep dimension is trying to tell you. And you're not going to find that in the ways that your culture, the spirit of the time at this particular time wants you to act and wants you to be, because it constantly wants you to address yourself to outward things. And sometimes it's whatever it is, political after all. Pretty soon another 20 years, the Nazis came, and even before that, by about 1919, 1920, the communists came and all of that, but it's still all outside. All of these people want you to address something outside of yourself. And if you don't mind me saying so, the same is true now. Always something out there. That's what you got to do. That's where it is. That's how you are going to be a good person, by getting involved something over there. Yeah, well, you might even appear, at least to yourself and to some others, as a little bit a good person, but you are not going to be a whole person. You are not going to be whole. Because in order to be whole, you have to address yourself to the call of the spirit of the deep, so to say. And that is how it starts out, that the spirit of the deep tells him to pay attention. So it's a this voice of the deep unconscious is non-rational, non-utilitarian. It wants to meld together, and this, of course, comes around all the time. And that's a very novel idea in 1913. That the way to come to really profound meaning is by way of bringing together in a reconciled condition opposites. Not being associated with one polarity and being against the other and denying it, but somehow bringing them together. The only place where you really find that is in alchemy. No wonder then that when Jung was finished with the Red Book, and when he decided, and I think was probably advised by some of his close friends who knew about the Red Book, because he revealed the fact that he had been writing the Red Book and that he had the Red Book, he revealed that to a very small number of people. I think altogether, over the years, there were probably no more than 10. He was very secretive about it. And so he was advised, and I think he recognized that if he published this at that time, not only wouldn't it do any good, but it would destroy him, because it would totally take away the role in which he appeared as a psychologist, as a scientist. It would have made him appear as an offbeat religious prophet, and that very circumstance and the content too was something that very few people would have appreciated at that time. And so I think he was well advised to stop and to delay. And so the book sat in an upper room at his house in Zurich, and his children would look at it, things like that. His son, Franz Jung, who then became the head of the family, he looked at. Franz used to take the Red Book to bed and read it, and various things. Just then. After Jung died and so on, then the family said, this is really something valuable. So they started locking it up. And finally, it ended up in a bank vault in Zurich. That's where it was when the people came who were to scan it and to print it again. But when it was all written, and Jung said, well, I have all this inspiration, I have all this material, now, you know, it has to come out to the world somehow, if not in the original form, then in another. And right at that time, as he was struggling with this issue, this was, I have it written down, so early 1920s, so 1920s, quite soon after the finishing of the Red Book, then Richard Wilhelm, the sinologist, the Chinese scholar, sent him a little manuscript that he had just translated. He admired Jung greatly. He said, I would like you to comment on this, to tell me what you think of it. And it came to be known as The Secret of the Golden Flower. And Jung read it, and even though it's Chinese alchemy that's expressed, you know, somewhat differently from West, I said, this is it, this is it. This is what, I mean, not, this is one important thing that I learned in the Red Book. It's another way of stating what I have learned in the Red Book. This is very important. And that was the beginning of his work with alchemy. The very first thing was the Secret of the Golden Flower, to which he had Wilhelm's translation from the Chinese and then his own commentaries to it. But he saw the principle, how the opposites, the two yin and yang come forth from the original unity, and how they interact with each other and ultimately need to combine with each other in order to create a permanent structure, a permanent being, which is the golden flower, the golden lotus, where they have united. So that is why he really then became so interested in alchemy, because he really translated the processes, or many of the processes that he had learned in the Red Book, into alchemy. He saw them there, and this, since there are all the pre-existing alchemical works, alchemical codices, he could present that to the world without their beginning to throw stones at him as this occultist, this mystic, this weirdo from Switzerland, you know. But right at the very beginning, the spirit of the depth shows him that there has to be a reconciliation of the opposites, and that a new divine image, what then later on came to be called the God image, is coming, and that the supreme meaning, which is the meaning brought by the understanding proceeding from the spirit of the depths, is the path and the way and the bridge. These are the three words that he mentions, to the new God, to the new divine image. So there is some, well, of course, you know, to say a new God is kind of silly, but what is meant here, of course, is that the divine and the way that humans relate to the divine and the ways in which the divine relates to the human is going to reconstellate itself in a manner that was not there before. And that this is coming, and that this is the center of the new dispensation, is going to be a new manifestation of the divine, but not necessarily as has been in the past as an embodied savior like Jesus, or some being of that sort, but ultimately really the discovery of the divine in the human. And we'll talk about that further. And that's the theme that comes up again and again in various stories, in various metaphors in the Red Book. Always there is a a divine being who needs to come forth, who needs to rise from the depths. Sometimes he's dead and he's being revived, and Jung is always there dealing with that and trying to help with that and to facilitate that. And of course, at a certain point, he begins to see that this is to a major extent within himself, and that as he is transformed, as he is being crucified and rises in the Elijah Salome experience, that is the way that the new Godhead comes forth. But the very first thing is paying attention to the spirit of the deep. Also, already this early in the first chapter, he brings up what subsequently was called, I'll quit in a minute, the shadow of the image of God. And it's not to be interpreted in any other way, but more, he has it here more like a terrestrial reflection. But the issue is that the reflection of the divine that we perceive before we are transformed is an inaccurate reflection. So the way that we perceive the greater reality before we have been appropriately changed is not right. It's screwed up. That's not the word he uses. Actually, there is no such word in German. Wouldn't mean any sense, but it's messed up. And perhaps, and that's now purely my interpretation, that so many of the difficulties and wrongfulness that arises from and within the existing religions themselves, that the perception of the Godhead has been partly accurate, but partly askew. Wasn't right. And then, of course, everything that flows from that becomes tainted with that sort of thing. And so one has to go about this business in a somewhat different manner. And one of the words that the spirit of the depths keeps using, that you have to be able to unite sense and nonsense as two of the opposites. Now, a lot of people wouldn't like that, because they say, nonsense is nonsense, you should forget about it. But there is, I can't put it in any other way, there is a very deep experiential aspect of this. And I know a little bit about that because I have experienced it, and that is that what appears as nonsense to our logic often has a strange kind of a deep internal sense of irony. It makes you laugh. It has to do something with the laughter of the gods in Mount Olympus. So don't dismiss things on a purely logical and extroverted basis. Don't just say that there is nonsense that is wisdom in another way and in another aspect. And so when the two are combined like many of the other opposites, then something real comes forth. And so already in the very beginning, in his discourse with the spirit of the depths, we find principles which appear then all throughout the book and really throughout his psychological teachings subsequently. And one of these is the coming of a new dispensation, the way to accomplish it, the inner God, the acceptance of the shadow, dealing with the unlived, with the unexpressed, with the unknown, with the unacceptable, and to bring that in the union of the the union of the opposites, and that these are really the principles of the coming transformation that he individually and humanity in general has to undergo.